Okay, so it's Cat Stanley Space Demon coming at you again. And today I want to talk about Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley from Kiss. And you know, they've had a lot of negative things to say about Peter Criss's drumming over the years. They have said that, yeah, Peter Criss was full of piss and vinegar in the beginning, and he was the perfect guy at the right time for Kiss. And that original lineup of Kiss, as everyone knows it, wouldn't have been the same without Peter Criss. They've kind of grudgingly come to say that over the years, but the vast majority of the things they've said in the press and in their respective memoirs has been resolutely negative. They've had a lot of terrible things to say vis-a-vis Peter Criss's drumming over the years. But today I want to go back to the early days of the band and talk about a statement that Paul Stanley said with regards to Peter's drumming during the recording of that album. Could be one of the most ludicrous statements Paul Stanley has ever made, and that's saying something when you think of all the bullshit Paul Stanley has said over the years. But that first Kiss album, which was released February 18th, 1974, was co-produced by Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise. And here's what Richie Wise had to say about Peter Criss's drumming on that record. He said, "In hindsight, Peter Criss was pretty terrible. At the time, I thought he was okay. He was not from the John Bonham AC/DC school. Therefore, the group didn't have that rock drum groove thing happening. In hindsight, he was very lucky to have been in that band." So co-producer Richie Wise had some negative things to say about Peter Criss's drumming during the making of that album. Pretty straightforward, but let me get to what Paul Stanley said back in his 2014 memoir, Face the Music, with regards to working in the studio with Peter Criss. He says, "We talked Peter through the songs as we recorded them. I had a microphone into which I had to say things like, 'Okay, here comes the dat-dat-dat,' or 'now the rat-a-tat-tat.' It was the only thing that worked." Now, can you imagine, you musicians out there, anytime you've been in a recording studio, the logistics of this? He's trying to suggest that during the recording sessions, Paul is vocally cueing him to where his drum fills have to be. Now, logistically, this is just ridiculous. How could this possibly happen? Now, I can understand, and maybe you're recording the basic track, maybe if he's cueing Peter with a nod or a look as to where maybe the fills are supposed to go. But this is so ridiculous because by the time Kiss went into the studio to record that first album, they had been on the road for almost a year, and the band rehearsed constantly. They have said, Gene and Paul have said, that they rehearsed 5 days a week. They were doing shows. This is for almost a year, and Ace Frehley has even commented he thought they practiced too much back in the day. He couldn't understand why they rehearsed so much. But to think about a band who had been performing that long, if Peter was such a terrible drummer by the time they got into the studio to make that first album, that he needs Paul Stanley to get on a squawk box to verbally cue him to where his drum fills, that's just ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense at all. How does he expect anyone to believe this bullshit? And also, we're talking about a band who had already recorded a professional sounding 5-song demo earlier in the year of 1973 with Eddie Kramer, a demo that many think sounds better than the first album. Personally, I think the demo sounds a lot better, and Peter's playing on that is dead nuts. And if you're anyone who plays music, if you're a musician, if you're playing songs and you're out playing them every day, 5 days a week, and you're playing them in clubs, you get into a groove where you know what you're doing. By the time a year rolls around, you know what you're going to play. You're locked in. And it's always been said that the recording of that first album was pretty smooth. The idea that after a year, they go into the studio and you got Paul Stanley having to talk Peter Criss through these songs that they had been working out for a year. Now, I could understand if maybe they had written the songs in the studio, if these were brand new songs, but everyone has said that that album, those songs were songs that they had. Those songs, they had them out down dead nuts. They basically went into the studio and recorded them as is. I know Kerner and Wise, they kind of truncated the songs. They got them into shorter, tighter versions, a bit less jammy than they had been playing them live, or the versions of the songs that they had recorded on that Kramer demo. If you listen to it, the first album's a lot less jammy than that. But this idea that Peter is going to be such a horrible drummer that after all this time, by the time they get in the studio, these songs they've been playing for a year. Now, I can understand, I don't know how long, why you'd be able to roll with a drummer for that long and not know he is that terrible. Now, I can understand maybe if you're playing with a bass player and then you're playing with them live, and by the time you get in the studio, you find out a guy can't really play bass. Now, that has happened. I think it happened with Motley Crue when they went in to record their first album. The producer, by the time they got in the studio, realized Nikki Sixx couldn't really play bass. Same thing happened with Sid Vicious in the Sex Pistols. And because it's the kind of thing, when you're listening to a band live, a lot of times in the volume of a club, in the volume of a rehearsal space, you don't always hear every note a bass player's playing, so you don't necessarily know exactly how good a bass player is. But a drummer, a guy that's holding things together, a guy that they had already recorded a demo with, a guy that they were playing with every night, why is this guy in your band if by the time you go in to make your first album with songs that you've been playing for a year, Paul Stanley's going, okay, Peter, tat-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, in the middle of the song? It's ridiculous. Now, this is just one man's opinion, of course. Maybe it went down the way Paul Stanley said, but you know, knowing what we know about how they recorded that album back in the day, where the basic tracks were pretty much recorded live. So you're saying Paul Stanley's playing, Peter Criss is playing, Gene Simmons is playing, and while Paul's playing, they're getting up to the verse, and Paul says, okay, tat-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, blah, blah, blah. It just does, it sounds logistically impossible. I just really don't know where Paul's coming from on this. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't know, maybe you musicians out there, maybe you have a different opinion on this. You guys who've had experience in recording studios, does this make sense to you? Maybe this is common practice in recording studios. I don't know. Guys telling drummers to go rat-tat-tat and dat-a-dat-dat in the middle of the song while they're laying down the basic tracks. I don't know, again, it's just my opinion. Sounds a little unlikely from a logistical standpoint that this is how they recorded that first Kiss album. Well, let me know what you think in the comments. As always, I love to hear your opinions with regards to the topic discussed hitherto. And I really hope you did dig this video. We'll see you next time.
Who's here?